Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Hoplite channel. It's been a while. I hope you had a good 4th of July, but we are back with a new episode entitled Novus Ordo Seclorum, or New Order of the Ages. That's right. Everybody, I hope you had a good 4th of July. We're back again. I decided against doing a wrap-up episode for my Great Reset series, the World Economic Forum 9-episode, 3-part series on the 3 books by Klaus Schwab. I think I've covered that topic ad nauseum, and the last thing I'm sure you wanted to see was another episode about that topic, since I cover more or less everything I wanted to cover in those 3 books. I will, however, as we go forward, incorporate these new episodes in with the World Economic Forum, Great Reset, grand scheme of things. So I'm going to do it that way. I hope you agree with my strategy here. But today we're talking about this phrase, what it means, and what I believe is coming down the pike in the near future for the United States and the Western world. So let's talk about this phrase with a little history, a little background, and then we'll bring it to modern times, and I'll kind of give you my overall hypothesis as to what's going on and where we are possibly headed. So the phrase, Latin, Novus Ordo Seclorum, means New Order of the Ages. And it's taken from the 4th poem of the Eclogues by the Roman poet Virgil. Okay, it was added to the Great Seal of the U.S. in 1782. And I don't mean like the United States had a big gigantic seal with flippers. It's the big circle with the eagle and the shield. You've seen it before. Anyway, it was added in 1782, and it was the design of Charles Thomson and William Barton. And these 2 guys were from the Founding Fathers era. I didn't know much about William Barton, but looking up the info on Charles Thomson, the guy had a pretty interesting history. I'll just tell a quick story about him. He was actually tasked by the Continental Congress to travel from DC to tell George Washington that he had been elected the first president of the United States. And he actually accompanied General Washington, President-elect Washington, from his home in Mount Vernon to DC. So he got to make that historic ride with the president back to DC. Another funny story is, I don't know if he was in the House or the Senate at the time, but another member of Congress attacked him with his cane outside of the House or Senate as they were about to enter, because Thomson allegedly was not keeping proper minutes for their meetings, as in he was omitting certain things that were said or perhaps doctoring them. And this particular member of Congress didn't quite care for that. So he literally walked up to Thomson and started to beat on him with his walking stick. And Thomson fenced him and defended himself with his own cane. And this kind of stuff happened back in the day. Like, there were duels. Somebody made a crack about somebody's wife, or made a public insult, and they might actually have to back it up with a gunfight. Or somebody just comes up on you as you're going into work to the House or Senate and starts to swipe at you with his cane. And I guess that actually resulted in several injuries to both men. So it was a wild time. Yeah, cane fights, duels, all that stuff. But anyway, Thomson and Barton are, given credit for the Great Seal, including this Latin phrase, and it was meant to signify the beginning of the American era, right? The United States had declared its independence from England. It had won the American Revolutionary War, and began a new chapter in world history. And this was the American era now. This was our time. That's what it was meant to signify. Fast forward about 150 years, and we see that the United States added the phrase to the $1 bill. And if you have a $1 bill handy, you can look at the portrait side, flip over to the reverse side. You'll see the pyramid with the eye. There's some masonry and symbology behind that, but I'm not going to get into that for this episode. It was meant, again, to signify the new American era because we had just emerged from the Great Depression. We were back on our feet and we were issuing new money to the people. And at this time, the United States dollar was still backed by gold. But that changed. But not, in 1945, we see the United States and its dollar, the US dollar, became the dominant world currency by volume post-World War II. And that was pretty much due to the fact that of all the Allied powers, well, save of course Canada, the United States had very little damage suffered to its economy or infrastructure on account of World War II, whereas the economies of Germany, France, Italy, Russia, the UK, they were pretty much devastated, especially their infrastructure, because of all the damage of World War II, and had to go into a rebuilding phase, and they went into heavy amounts of debt to make that happen. The United States, because we had the entire Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean separating us, our only damage to our infrastructure of significance was Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, far away from our mainland. So America, by default, became the dominant world currency by volume because of that good fortune and the fact that we helped kick serious butt in World War II. So our economy was humming, and the infrastructure upon which the economy was based was largely untouched and was still roaring. The US dollar thereby replaced the pound, the British pound, that was the previous dominant currency. Fast forward 30 years or so, the US dollar in 1971 becomes the world reserve currency, and this was known as the petrodollar system. And if you've been watching the channel, I covered in a previous episode, I think titled Under Currency Wars, which has a lot to do with this episode. Henry Kissinger, on behalf of the Nixon administration, decided to remove the US dollar from the gold-backed system, which is what we had in 1935 and prior, up until 71, and go to a petrodollar system. And this meant that a deal was struck between the Saudi royal family, among other countries in the Middle East, that if the Saudis and others were to accept for buys, sells, and trade petroleum, but only did so with US dollars, well, then the US government would pledge its military support to the Saudi royal family in exchange for this. So it's basically like a mafia deal, right? It's like, hey, listen, you agree to buy, sell, and trade any petroleum that you control with US dollars only, meaning anyone who wants to buy petroleum off you, or perhaps sell it, or perhaps trade it, if they do so, they have to do it in our currency. And if you hold up this part of the bargain, Uncle Sam's big green army will come and save your bacon if and when you need it. And the Saudis said, sure, we don't have to build up an army. We've got the best army in the world who's promising to protect us if we just use their currency for, what's under our feet, so be it. And so the petrodollar system was born in 71, and the US economy, despite the 1970s, saw a resurgence in the 80s and beyond. And we went from a gold-backed system to a petroleum-backed system. 50 years later, we see in 2021, the BRICS nations, this would be Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, concluded a pilot program of their central bank digital currency, this CBDC. And if you're not familiar with what CBDCs are, I recommend you do a Google search or internet search for what the CBDC system is and how this new system coming in to the world economy is going to forever change the game. When we go to a CBDC system, and I believe it's going to happen, I don't think it's a question of if, it's kind of when, like which countries are going to transition to a CBDC system. It's going to be a matter of who's first and who's last. The BRICS countries concluded their pilot in 2021, or so they claim. I believe the Chinese probably concluded their pilot program a year or two earlier than this. But the BRICS nations concluded the program. 2 years later, roughly, June 22nd, which would have been less than a month ago, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says publicly that the US dollar is expected to gradually decline as the world reserve currency. And that should have been a huge flare into the sky that the US is in serious trouble. When the Treasury Secretary of the US says publicly, so that the world can hear, that US citizens can expect the US dollar to gradually decline as the world reserve currency, yeah, that is earth-shaking news. But what happened 2 weeks later? On July 7th of this year, 2 days ago, President Vladimir Putin of Russia announces a gold-backed BRICS CBDC will be introduced in August of this year. So Vladimir Putin is telling the world, about 2 weeks after Yellen says the US dollar is going to gradually decline as a world reserve currency, he comes out and says, well, the BRICS has a gold-backed CBDC and it'll be here in a month or less. Okay. So the big question for this episode is, with all this being a known quantity now, the US dollar, is it actually facing a gradual decline, or are we looking at something more like a crash? And my theory is this. When your government comes and tells you there's an emergency and we need to act now, we need to save lives, we need to do this in a matter of days or weeks or months at the most, what they're trying to do is to move you from A to point B, so that when you get to point B and learn the truth that there was no such emergency, which you should have known anyway because you're probably looking around like, I don't see an emergency. What are you talking about? Like, everything looks normal. No, there's an emergency. You got to get from A to B quick. And then once you're at point B, you won't be able to go back to point A because they will have closed the door behind you. When the government tells you there's an emergency and it's not readily apparent, as in you can see the emergency they're talking about, there's this emergency that you can't see but they say is there, they're trying to get you to move as fast as you can from A to B because they need you to get off of A and get on to B, whatever it might be. They want you there. They don't want you here. And then once you're there, there's no going back. On the flip side, when your government or Secretary of the Treasury tells you you can expect a gradual decline, that means they don't want you to leave A and go to B. They want you to believe that everything's fine, even though they see a category 5 on the radar and it's bearing down on your location probably pretty soon. They're saying, well, yeah, but if they move from B, like, what does that mean for us? It's like, well, it's not good for us because we can't get off A. This hurricane's going to hit us, so it might as well hit them too. They don't want you to leave A to B. They don't want you to get off the US dollar. They don't want you to go to the bank, withdraw all your money, and buy precious metals or digital assets that might be able to be compatible with the new CBDC system. They don't want you buying real estate. They don't want you buying hard assets that will suffer but not depreciate as much as a fiat currency will. They don't want you doing that because that will crash their system before they have a chance to, come up with an alternative. And I think the alternative is being unveiled right now in the next week or two, and it's the FedNow system. The Federal Reserve Bank of the US, which, by the way, is not federal at all, it's actually private. Do a whole episode on that. They're putting out something called the FedNow system, which is, I believe, a prototype CBDC for the United States. It offers seamless, instant payments and instant settlements in the US. It might work, it might not, but I believe the FedNow system is the US dollar's transition to a CBDC. They're telling you you can expect a gradual decline because they don't want you to get out of that pilot system before they're ready to put you in it. If you're getting off of the US dollar and you transition away, they want you to seamlessly be there for the US dollar transition to the US CBDC, the digital dollar. But if you migrate away before that happens, well, they lose you. And now you're outside that system, which is good for you and bad for them. This is what I believe is going on. And this is the new order of the ages. The CBDC system, which the BRICS nations are going to unveil in a month or less, is going to separate the BRICS nations and all those who choose to join them from the US dollar system, which means you can probably expect a dollar crash. And I don't know if it's going to be this year or next year, or if it'll take 3 years, but it's going to happen. And people like Janet Yellen and Joe Biden and everybody else in our government who helped hasten this with the proxy war in Ukraine and wielding the US dollar like a sword, they have swung that sword around at so many people that all of those people looked around and decided to join forces, and that's BRICS. And like bringing down a woolly mammoth, 2 cavemen can't do it, 5 can't do it, 10 probably can't do it, but 15 or 20 can do it. And the BRICS coalition are those 20 cavemen that are looking to bring down the woolly mammoth that is the US dollar, because they don't want to live under the hegemony of the US via the petro system. That's why they're going to a gold-backed system. They're putting a hard commodity behind their central bank digital currency, which means the rest of the world can feel safe in using and trading in it because it has a hard asset behind it. When we got off of the gold system and went to the petro system, we figured, well, since we control the world, the lifeblood of the first world, which is petroleum and gas, we can just, print as much as we want, because the world's going to have to use our dollars anyway. Why don't we just keep printing it? Why don't we just make more? And that way we can raise taxes later as much as we want. We can spend as much as we want, because again, we can just go back to the printing press and crank out more. The rest of the world saw this and realized that the US dollar is only supported by one thing, and that's the US military. And after the fiascos in Vietnam, in the first Gulf War, in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we saw 2 years ago when it finally ended in catastrophe, the rest of the world looked at the US like a broken, beaten old man who still thought he was a young man who could threaten you as he did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And they're not scared anymore. And we have tons of debt. We have tons of unfunded liabilities. So does China. But China figures, well, if we're going to be crushed by our debt, we're not going to let you crush us. If our debt is going to take us down, we're doing it with our own system, and we'll no longer live under your system. Now, we might want to go to war with Russia. For some reason, people in our government have almost like a blood feud with Russia. Russia has probably the most formidable military in Europe that the US could possibly face. But if you compound that military strength with the economy of China and India and Brazil and others, that's a war we cannot possibly win. Economically, we can't win it. And my big fear is this: if we are facing a crash versus a decline, you could potentially see panic in the United States, because people aren't going to know what to do with themselves if they wake up one day and the money they spent, or the money they saved over the course of their lives, the money they didn't spend but put into their 401k, if that suffers a crash because of the BRICS coalition going off of the US dollar system, these people now won't have enough for retirement. They're going to look around and say, well, I had $300,000 in my retirement fund, and you're telling me it's now 35% reduced in value? So now I can't retire, because that 35% puts me out of my window where I could comfortably retire at this age. And now this house that I bought 10 years ago for $500,000, you're telling me is worth $250,000? So I can't sell this thing for the equity I put into it. And you think these companies that have bought these goods are going to sell them to you at reduced prices? No, they're going to inflate their prices to make up the difference in what they purchased their goods for. So the things you buy in America are going to be more expensive to purchase. The things you have that you bought years ago that you wanted to invest in and sell, they're going to be worth less. And worst of all, the dollar in your pocket is going to be worth so much less that you're going to wonder why you even bothered keeping it. And that's where real panic sets in. And if these cities in America can't fund all of the government programs and subsidies that they've promised to people, people will start burning the place down like you see in France. I mean, France's problem is due almost entirely to unchecked third world migration, which may have been the plan all the time, which leads me to believe that possibly the US dollar imploding and facing a gradual decline or a crash was known to the US government on the inside years ago. And they figured, well, if it's going to crash, we might as well just crash it ourselves, and then we'll roll out our own US digital dollar to replace it. And we'll just seamlessly convert people from one system to the other. And if it happens that we crash beforehand, well, we'll just blame it on Russia for the war in Ukraine, and we'll blame it on China, and that'll be our excuse. But that's the new order of the ages. It's coming. The US dollar, I don't think it's going to be a gradual decline, is, I guess, the main point. I think we're looking at a crash because the government doesn't want you finding a way out of this system and potentially causing a run on the banks. There are Western nations, I hear, even in Australia, I heard that some people are going to the bank and they're being told that they can't take out more than $500 or $1,000 at a time. They might have $50,000 in there, but the bank's telling them, yeah, we're limiting all withdrawals to $1,000 a week or less. It's your money, but if the bank's the custodian of it, how are you going to get them to give it to you? If they've been told by the government to restrict withdrawals, they're going to do what the government tells them. And it doesn't matter if it's your money in their account or not. As far as they're concerned, it's their money. And this is the problem. And the reason CBDCs will be even more dangerous is you will have your account with banks, and these banks will be under the control of these CBDCs, which central banks will essentially issue to the regional and local banks. And they'll come with stipulations and rules, as in we don't permit certain purchases with this digital currency. Maybe guns and ammo aren't allowed to be purchased. Maybe tickets internationally outside of NATO countries won't be allowed. You can't fly to Russia, you can't fly to South Africa, you can't fly to Brazil. Maybe these digital currencies have expiration dates on them, as in once they're issued to you, this new digital dollar will expire in a year, meaning you can't save enough money to possibly get out of this system. These are all possibilities for a central bank digital currency, and don't think for 1 second that China and Russia haven't considered building that into their own CBDCs. And that is exactly where freedom will die, is if people literally can't use currency beyond a certain point in time or outside of a certain regional jurisdiction. You are then a prisoner to time and region, and you do not have freedom anymore. And this is possibly where we're going, because if there is a crash, the last thing they want is you having the freedom to possibly take your country back and do something about it. But again, that's just speculation. But this is what I see going on right now. I'll do some more episodes on this topic, but I think this is of vital importance right now. When I saw that news article break 2 days ago and Putin announcing to the world, yeah, we've got a gold-backed BRICS CBDC, and we're going to have a summit in August and introduce it formally. When I saw that news break, and then 2 weeks ago, Janet Yellen saying, well, you can expect a gradual US dollar decline as the world reserve currency. Big flashing red lights, danger, danger. Buckle up and make sure your chin strap is tight on your helmet because it's going to be bumpy. Anyway, if you agree or disagree, that's what the comment section is for. I appreciate you coming by. This was a shorter episode, I hope, than my usually hour-long videos, but if you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And yeah, I think I'm going to maybe stay on this series of topics. I like the current event stuff. I'm going to get away from book reviews because it's very labor intensive, and I can get out these shorter videos quicker to you. And I think that's what I'm going to do for the foreseeable future. But in the meantime, I hope you had a good 4th of July, as I said before. And yeah, we will see what happens in the days, weeks, and months to come. Till then, take it easy.